June 1942. The world was on fire. In less than 3 years, the Second World War had already swallowed over 40 million lives, turned cities into craters, and nations into factories of grief. From the ruins of London to the steppes of Stalingrad, humanity was learning what happens when technology outpaces mercy. And in the middle of that global machine stood a boy too small to matter. 5'5", 110 pounds, 16 years old. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a shadow that the war would forget. But history, as it always does, had other plans. In Hunt County, Texas, the cotton fields were dry and the sky carried dust instead of clouds. Here, a barefoot boy named Audie Murphy dragged an old .22 rifle through the weeds, hunting not for sport, but for dinner. Each bullet was currency, each shot a calculation of survival. The Great Depression had trained him in a brutal arithmetic. One miss meant one empty stomach. When Pearl Harbor fell in December 1941, America called its sons to arms. But when Murphy answered, the military laughed. Too small, too young, too light. He was rejected by the Marines, the Navy, and even the elite paratroopers. They saw a frail farm boy, not the quiet precision of a survivor. They saw his body, not his hunger. Yet poverty had done what no drill sergeant could. It had built a soldier out of necessity. By the spring of 1942, America needed men faster than it could train them. The draft board stopped asking questions. Murphy's sister forged his age on a slip of paper. The recruiter looked up, sighed, and stamped his fate. Accepted. He was still a child, walking into a war that would erase childhood. The statistics were merciless. For every American infantryman who landed in Europe, the odds of surviving a full year of combat were barely 1 in 3. At the time Murphy signed his enlistment, 12,000 soldiers were dying each week across the globe. But the boy from Texas wasn't thinking about statistics. He was thinking about the promise of 3 meals a day and a paycheck to send home. At basic training, the other recruits called him Kid, Babyface, the runt who couldn't lift his pack. But then came the rifle range. The laughter stopped. Those calm blue eyes went still as glass. One by one, the targets vanished every shot, a memory of a rabbit he'd needed to hit to feed his siblings. Something ancient was waking inside him, a focus sharper than fear. By the time the troopship carried him across the Atlantic in 1943, Murphy was no longer a farm boy. He was a calculation the world hadn't seen before, a fusion of hunger, instinct, and impossible precision. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 2 years, this 110-pound teenager would stand alone on a frozen battlefield, facing 6 armored vehicles and 250 enemy soldiers, and hold them all off to save his men. But that's not where his story begins. It begins here under the Texas sun, in the dust and silence of poverty, where a boy learned that survival, once mastered, can become something terrifying, unstoppable courage. By 1943, the world was bleeding out. Every month, 500,000 men vanished into the mud of Europe and the Pacific. The U.S. Army was expanding faster than any force in history. 8 million recruits trained, fed, and thrown into the furnace of global war. But war doesn't shape everyone equally. Some men are trained by sergeants, others are trained by hunger. Audie Murphy had been trained by both. At Camp Walters, Texas, he was the smallest recruit in his company. His uniform hung loose, his helmet slipped over his eyes. The drill instructors called him Shorty, Little Texas, or worse, the mascot. Every step of the obstacle course seemed to mock him. He wasn't built for endurance, he was built for necessity. But something about the boy's silence unsettled the others. He never complained, he never joked. When they stopped to breathe, he kept moving. When they slept, he cleaned his rifle. The first time the platoon lined up at the rifle range, they expected another humiliation. Instead, they watched disbelief turn to quiet awe. Murphy raised the Springfield, exhaled once, and every bullet found its mark. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The instructors thought it was luck. It wasn't. It was the remnant of thousands of nights in Texas when missing a shot meant no supper for 12 hungry mouths. By the summer of 1943, Murphy shipped out Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Division, bound for Sicily. When he stepped off the landing craft, he was 18 years old, 112 pounds, and about to enter a battlefield that devoured one American every 7 minutes. Sicily was supposed to be a short campaign. It became a grinding education in chaos. The air stank of diesel and dust. German machine guns ruled the high ground, and every hill became a miniature fortress. Soldiers called it the furnace. Murphy's first test came near Palermo. His unit was pinned by a machine gun nest. The order was to wait for support. But Murphy didn't wait. He moved like smoke, low, silent, invisible. The others watched that small figure slip through the rocks, tossing grenades with the precision of someone who had been throwing them in his mind for years. When the gun fell silent, he turned their own weapon against them, covering the retreat. It was his first taste of what the war demanded: initiative without orders, courage without witnesses. Captain Paul Harris wrote in his report, "Private Murphy displays a natural aptitude for combat that is extraordinary." Extraordinary didn't begin to cover it. Sicily hardened him. Every night he watched friends vanish, bodies covered by blankets before sunrise. By the time his unit reached mainland Italy, the war had already taken 70,000 American lives. At the Volturno River, October 1943, Murphy's squad was ambushed. His commanding officer was hit. Murphy crawled forward through the mud, found a fallen sniper rifle, and held the line alone for an hour. 5 enemy soldiers dropped one by one, measured silent shots through smoke and rain. For that, he received the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest medal. But medals meant nothing to him. He kept a simple ledger in his mind. One more day alive meant one more letter home. In Anzio, 1944, the war reached a fever pitch. The beachhead was a trap, a 15-mile strip of mud and wreckage under constant shell fire. Anzio Annie, a German railway gun the size of a train car, rained destruction daily. By February, 20,000 Allied soldiers were casualties, and the sea ran black with oil and smoke. Murphy survived by instinct. He learned to read artillery like weather, to move just before the ground exploded beneath him. He no longer flinched at the sound. He anticipated it. He felt it. A fellow soldier remembered. Murph didn't fight angry. That's what made him scary. He fought cold, like he was doing math. Near Cisterna, a German tank cornered his platoon. The others froze. Murphy didn't. He dragged a bazooka across the mud, crawled within 40 yards, and fired. The explosion flipped the tank's turret. He no longer cared about victory. He cared about the faces beside him. August 1944. France. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of the southern coast. The mission: cut off German retreat from Normandy. He no longer cared about victory. He cared about the faces beside him. August 1944. France. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of the southern coast. The mission: cut off German retreat from Normandy. Murphy's unit landed near Ramatuelle, pushing north through vineyards and shattered villages. Somewhere outside Montélimar, a shell killed his commanding officer instantly. The platoon froze. Murphy didn't. He took command 18 Americans against a company of over 100. For 2 hours, they held a crossroads vital to the Allied advance. Murphy coordinated fire, crawled under machine gun bursts, and personally neutralized 15 enemy soldiers. For that impossible stand, the army gave him a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. He had entered the war as a boy, too small to wear a helmet properly. 2 years later, he commanded men older, stronger, and far more broken than himself. But by then, something inside him had changed. His letters home became shorter, colder. His handwriting grew tighter, his words fewer. The war had rewired him, turned instinct into precision, emotion into efficiency. By the winter of 1944, Europe was freezing, and so was Audie Murphy. He'd lost his smile, his softness, his childhood. What remained was a mechanism built entirely of purpose and endurance. And as January 1945 approached, the war would test that mechanism to its breaking point. In the forests of eastern France, in a place called Worldwar, Murphy would face the moment that would rewrite military history. A blizzard. 6 armored tanks, 250 enemy soldiers, 40 Americans left alive, one 110-pound lieutenant with a leg wound and an impossible choice to make. The boy who was too small for war was about to become the man who stopped one. "They looked like an avalanche," he said later, "and we were the snow." Murphy had 2 disabled tank destroyers, 1 telephone wire to artillery, and 40 men too cold to feel fear. He knew the numbers. He did the math. It didn't add up. At 1:40 p.m., German shells shredded the tree line. The first M10 tank destroyer took a direct hit, engulfed in flames. The crew bailed out, running for the woods. The second slid into a drainage ditch, its treads spinning helplessly. The entire anti-tank defense was gone. Murphy made a choice no manual had ever written. He ordered his men to retreat deeper into the forest, and then he ran toward the fire. He sprinted through smoke and shrapnel toward the burning M10. Diesel roared from its ruptured fuel lines, feeding black flames. Inside the hull, 300 gallons of fuel and 51 rounds of high-explosive ammunition, a bomb waiting to happen. Murphy climbed onto the turret. He grabbed the .50-caliber Browning machine gun, each round the size of a man's thumb, and then he opened fire. Witnesses said it looked impossible. One figure, swallowed in smoke, standing atop a burning tank. The .50 cal roared like thunder. The tracer rounds cut orange lines through the blizzard. Each burst precise, measured, unrelenting. "They looked like an avalanche," he said later, "and we were the snow." Murphy had 2 disabled tank destroyers, 1 telephone wire to artillery, and 40 men too cold to feel fear. He knew the numbers. He did the math. It didn't add up. At 1:40 p.m., German shells shredded the tree line. The first M10 tank destroyer took a direct hit, engulfed in flames. The crew bailed out, running for the woods. The second slid into a drainage ditch, its treads spinning helplessly. The entire anti-tank defense was gone. Murphy made a choice no manual had ever written. He ordered his men to retreat deeper into the forest, and then he ran toward the fire. He sprinted through smoke and shrapnel toward the burning M10. Diesel roared from its ruptured fuel lines, feeding black flames. Inside the hull, 300 gallons of fuel and 51 rounds of high-explosive ammunition, a bomb waiting to happen. Murphy climbed onto the turret. He grabbed the .50-caliber Browning machine gun, each round the size of a man's thumb, and then he opened fire. Witnesses said it looked impossible. One figure, swallowed in smoke, standing atop a burning tank. The .50 cal roared like thunder. The tracer rounds cut orange lines through the blizzard. Each burst precise, measured, unrelenting. German infantry advanced within 10 yards. They fell back, stunned. Murphy called in artillery fire with one hand while firing with the other. "Fire for effect!" he shouted into the phone. The first 105mm shells exploded 50 yards in front of him, shaking the ground. He didn't stop. For 1 hour, Murphy fought alone, bleeding, frozen, surrounded. It was more than courage. It was calculation. He used the smoke to blind the enemy, used their own confusion as cover. The tanks couldn't advance without their infantry. Their infantry couldn't advance because of him. Military historians later estimated 10,000 rounds were fired at his position. Statistically, he should have been hit 15 to 20 times. He was struck once by shrapnel. He ignored it. At 3:10 p.m., when the Browning finally sputtered dry, the Germans surged. Murphy grabbed his carbine, fired until the bolt locked open. Then he made his final call. "Fire on my position." The artillery officer refused. Murphy shouted again, voice breaking through static. "That's a direct order. Fire on my position now." Seconds later, the world exploded. Shells rained down across the field, shredding the German advance. Snow turned black. The tanks reversed course. The attack collapsed. At 3:20 p.m., silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning M10. Murphy climbed down, uniform scorched, face smeared with soot. 10 minutes later, the tank behind him detonated in a burst of fire. He didn't look back. He just limped into the woods, asked his men if anyone was hurt, and lit a cigarette with steady hands. That single action had saved Company B, halted a 250-man assault, and secured the Allied flank in Alsace. Within a week, the Colmar pocket fell, 50,000 German troops captured or killed. The Rhine cleared for the final push into Germany. The Medal of Honor would follow. So would parades, headlines, the word legend. But the boy who stood on that burning tank didn't feel like a legend. He felt hollow, because behind the hero's silence was the cost. Every friend he'd ever trained with was gone. Every victory smelled like loss. And when the guns finally fell silent, Audie Murphy would return home, not as the man who conquered fear, but as the man who could never escape it. The war outside had ended. The war inside was just beginning. May 1945. The guns fell silent, but the silence was not peace. Across the planet, over 75 million people were dead, more than half of them civilians. In Europe alone, 1 in every 8 men under 30 had been erased. Cities were hollow shells, nations were counting ghosts. For the soldiers who survived, home was no longer home. Audie Murphy stepped off the ship in New York to applause, cameras, and banners. The newspapers called him America's most decorated soldier. 33 awards, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. To the public, he was proof that courage still meant something. To Murphy, it all felt like noise. He was 20. He looked 40. Behind those calm blue eyes was a mind that never left the battlefield. Every door slam was artillery. Every shadow moved. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. The doctors called it battle fatigue. Today, we call it PTSD. Back then, it had no treatment, only shame. By 1946, more than 1 million American veterans were diagnosed with psychoneurotic disorders, but most hid their symptoms. Society expected heroes, not haunted men. Murphy tried to fit that image. He posed for Life magazine, shook hands, smiled for the cameras. Inside, he was unraveling. Night after night, he woke drenched in sweat, seeing faces of friends who never came home. He couldn't stand darkness. It reminded him of patrols where silence meant death. He moved to the garage and slept with the lights on. Hollywood came calling. In 1950, he starred in To Hell and Back, a film based on his own autobiography. It became Universal's highest-grossing movie for 2 decades. On screen, he reenacted the moment he stood on that burning tank. The audience cheered. But when the director yelled cut, Murphy's hands shook. He was reliving it, not acting. The world saw glory. He saw ghosts. By the early 1950 seconds, the toll was visible. He had nightmares, insomnia, violent flashbacks. His first marriage collapsed after 16 months. Actress Wanda Hendricks later said, "He was 2 men, during the day gentle and kind. At night, he was back in the war." Murphy turned to sleeping pills, then to silence. But in 1960, when Vietnam began claiming a new generation of soldiers, he broke that silence. In an era when mental health was taboo, America's greatest war hero spoke publicly about his demons. He wrote in the Saturday Evening Post, "What about the veterans who can't sleep? What about the ones who can't stop fighting after they come home?" It was the most dangerous thing he'd ever done, tell the truth. That truth inspired a shift. For the first time, lawmakers and doctors began discussing trauma as injury, not weakness. Murphy had faced tanks and artillery, but this battle against stigma was lonelier, longer, harder. He spent the next decade quietly helping others. He visited hospitals, met with veterans, donated to recovery programs. When asked why, he said, "I've seen what happens when the war doesn't end." But the demons never fully left him. He carried them the way he once carried his rifle, always ready, always heavy. The 28th of May, 1971. Murphy boarded a small private plane bound for Virginia. A storm rolled in. The aircraft went down in the mountains. He was 45 years old. America mourned a hero, but the real story wasn't over, because someone else was about to pick up where he left off, someone who had seen both the hero and the haunted man, and refused to let either be forgotten. Her name was Pamela Murphy. The war ended long ago, but its echoes never did. When Audie Murphy's plane went down in the mountains of Virginia in May 1971, it wasn't just the death of a soldier, it was the fall of a symbol, the boy who had defied the impossible, now claimed by a storm he couldn't fight. He left behind 2 sons, a nation of admirers, and one woman who had stood beside him in silence, Pamela Murphy. The headlines called her the widow of America's greatest hero. But Pamela wasn't interested in headlines. She was interested in unfinished missions. Audie had spent his life fighting for his men, first on the battlefield, then in the quiet trenches of veterans' hospitals. When he died, Pamela looked at the world he'd left and saw the same problem he had seen: too many forgotten soldiers, too many broken systems. She made a decision that shocked everyone. Instead of writing a memoir, instead of selling her husband's medals, she walked into the West Los Angeles Veterans Affairs Medical Center and asked for a job. Not as a figurehead, not as a speaker, as a clerk. She didn't use the name Murphy as power, she used it as responsibility. From the 1972 through the early 2000s, she sat behind a small wooden desk and became the quiet engine of that hospital. Every day, she arrived before dawn. She sorted files, answered calls, fought bureaucracy with the precision her husband once used on a rifle range. When a veteran's check was delayed, she tracked it down. When an appointment was cancelled, she made it happen. Doctors and nurses came and went. Pamela stayed. By the 1982, she had personally assisted thousands of veterans, many of them from Vietnam, young men carrying the same invisible wounds that had haunted Audie. Some came in angry, some addicted, some hopeless. Pamela listened to them all. She knew the smell of fear, the language of loss. She didn't need to read charts to see what was broken. She had lived it. In her quiet way, she became what the military calls a force multiplier. She couldn't stop the wars, but she could repair the systems that forgot the warriors. Colleagues said she moved through the hallways like gravity, calm, steady, impossible to ignore. When administrators denied a veteran's claim, she would walk into their office and stand there until they changed their mind. One doctor recalled, "When Pamela Murphy asked you for something, you didn't argue, you just did it." By the 1992, the VA hospital had become her battlefield and her home. She turned compassion into logistics, love into policy. She worked without privilege, without publicity, often using her own paycheck to buy food for homeless vets who came through the doors. Her mission lasted 35 years. She retired in 2007 at the age of 87. When she died in 2010, the Los Angeles Times didn't print a front-page obituary, but the hospital did something better. They lined the hallways with veterans. Hundreds stood at attention, saluting as her body was carried out. Some were missing limbs, some were in wheelchairs, but all stood for her. It was the kind of honor no medal could buy. 2,000 miles away, in Texas, another building carried the name Audie L. Murphy Memorial VA Hospital. The steel letters gleamed under the southern sun, but Pamela had been the living memorial, the continuation of the story no one had written, the field mechanic who kept her husband's mission running long after his war was done. Between them, they had rewritten what heroism meant. He proved that courage could stop an army. She proved that kindness could heal one. The historian's ledger shows the facts. One boy, one woman, 2 lives shaped by war. But beneath the numbers lies something greater, a map of human endurance. Murphy's stand at Holtzwehr saved 40 men in 1945. Pamela's stand at the VA saved thousands over the next 4 decades. Both faced hopeless odds. Both refused to retreat. Both understood the same truth. You don't need a weapon to fight for people. You just need to care enough not to quit. The story ends where it began, with an idea that sometimes the smallest people make the largest impact. That love, in its purest form, is not quiet, it's relentless. And when the final chapter closes, when the guns fade and the dust settles, what remains isn't the sound of war. It's the echo of two hearts that never stopped serving,